Welcome to Everything is a Primary Source, the podcast version of going up and down your radio dial and treating everything that comes through your speaker as a document of history. That's right, radio is our focal point today, and to help dissect and discover ideas about the media form, I've lined up two radio professionals to help me out. Taylor Cormier is a producer and news talk host and will be talking about 1938 through Orson Welles' rendition of The War of the Worlds. But first, Logan Sherwood, who co-hosts WOKQ's morning show, stopped by my table this spring to chat about his channel's format, country music. Take a listen.
Guest for the day here at Prescott Park Podcast Karaoke with the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and I'm so glad to have Logan from WOKQ.
Yes.
And 97.5, and I picked up one of your bumper stickers, and they look like they're from like the 80s. I love that the script on there.
They're not changing that for anything.
Why not?
I don't know. Dude, it's funny because I actually I was the new guy who suggested, hey, why don't we do a rebrand? And they said, get the heck out of here. This is a tenured station over 50 years, so no, they weren't changing it whatsoever. The red, white, and blue logo is there to stay.
That's going to be there, and it fits the bill. I mean, I think, and literally the bill, because you have it on your hat too.
Oh, so this hat actually was in one of our sales person's office, and it was collecting dust. And you see how it has the green brim?
Yeah.
That's how you know it's old school.
Legit. Like
the green brims on ball caps is like super old school. So I took it and said, this is mine now.
I can picture this like maybe 30, 40, 35 years ago, like a bunch of those hats probably at a table like this one.
Exactly.
Under a tent and like handing them out to people stopping by. So has OKQ been a country music station the entire run?
I think so. I say I think so, and if my boss heard me say I think so, she'd hit me. But yes, it has been.
And you spotted on the table that I have a bunch of artifacts. I call even pop culture stuff artifacts because that's what they are. A ticket from 1990, and they had a country music festival here in Prescott Park.
Yeah, did it have a price on that thing?
It did actually. And you don't see tickets like that. It's from Ticketmaster and everything. So not an exorbitant amount of money, but what I do for this podcast and even the karaoke style.
What do you got?
By the way,
I thought it was singing, so
no, wait,
I'm not doing
you
that.
can if you want. I use this method in my classroom. I have my students break down primary sources using these questions. But for today,
AP History.
I do take it. Did you take AP?
I did take AP History.
I teach AP History, so you got to go in like 5 minutes. So I'll make this quick. Why did they make a country music station in northern New England?
Why did they make it?
Yeah, why do you think country?
Done. Too easy. New Hampshire and Maine, and parts of Mass, but really New Hampshire and Maine is country.
Yeah.
It is the blue-collared workers. It's the up at the crack of dawn and working until the sun's going down, and then having a cold one at the end of the night. I think New Hampshire and Maine really encompass what the country lifestyle is, and it's not just the type of music; it's a lifestyle.
Yeah.
I want to say he was either Jason Aldean or Luke Bryan. I want to say it was Luke Bryan who said that he can bring anyone onto his farm, and within 30 seconds he can tell if they're country or not.
Right.
And I think it's just that the willingness to work hard, and that's something that New Hampshire and Maine residents really do have.
Yeah, I think it's probably just because it's been so associated with Southern culture over the years. In country western, you got the kind of like the epicenters of country music being Nashville and then in Texas.
Yeah.
And that seems, I think most people are like, well, it's Southern music. It's really not. But the message of so many of the songs and the style of music is universal. It just happens to be that a lot of the artists are from the South, but it's applicable up here just as much as anywhere else.
I also think you're getting new artists breaking into country who, for example, Ed Sheeran, Post Malone, like they are not country artists whatsoever.
Yeah.
But they're curious about country music because it holds so much history worldwide. I mean, bluegrass music, rock and roll, they're all encompassing. Country, bluegrass, rock and roll, they're all like one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's folk music, really, is what it comes down to. And, folk being just people's music, like ordinary people, and not hyper-trained. It's, like rock and roll seems to have gotten in a weird spot in the last, I'd say 20 years or so, where you can actually go to school, to the school of rock. And I'm like, I don't know, rock and roll, you shouldn't be like learning it necessarily. It just kind of like comes from you. And, when I think of 1990s era, I always think of Garth Brooks. And he is such a great, I love Garth Brooks. He seemed like he was having like, specials on NBC like every week back then in the early 90s. And because he wanted to go, well, first he wanted to play baseball, but he wanted to he was like, do I do rock and roll or do I do country? And it's like a lot of it had to be from where he was from, Oklahoma City, and like I'll do country. That's more my roots. But he definitely combined the rock and roll 100%. Concert into his concerts and his music.
Yeah, country is absolutely not one genre of music.
Right.
Like, there's so many different ways country music has gone and can gone. There's a lot of country music now, and in 50 years we'll be looking back at this time of country music and going, country music turned really poppy,
right?
Almost rap. I mean, there's like a rap country artist.
There's
right
a lot
now.
of crossover stuff.
This is a really interesting type of country music, but ultimately, country music is just expanding, and artists are not practicing. They're putting into place crossover and experimenting, and I think that's awesome.
It is, and
you don't have to stay in one lane.
I was following your Instagram when Taylor Swift came to town, Gillette Stadium.
Yep.
She started out as a country, that genre.
Yes, we actually played Taylor Swift's music on our station first.
That's right.
First radio station.
Did she come to the studio, or was it just being? I remember hearing kind of like legends of that, like stories of Taylor Swift showing up and playing live on the radio. But she is definitely not that. Thank you so much, Logan, for stopping by.
Appreciate it.
And we'll do this again sometime.
That'd be awesome. Really cool stuff.
Take care.
I look forward to doing more podcast karaoke 1 month from now in the home of country music, Nashville, Tennessee, as I present my show in the Everything as a Primary Source teaching method at the National Council for the Social Studies and their annual conference. I hope to see you there. On Sunday evening, October 30th, 1938, listeners of the Mercury Theater on the CBS radio network were privy to a special presentation by visionary entertainer Orson Welles. He was going to tell his version of H.G. Wells' story, The War of the Worlds, but using the format of a news broadcast to tell it. The radio drama was groundbreaking in several ways, making The War of the Worlds not only iconic, but an outstanding primary source of the late 1930s in America. Joining me to discuss this historic media on its 85th anniversary is Taylor Cormier. Taylor is an executive producer of the Boston-based, nationally syndicated news talk program, The Howie Carr Show. He even fills in as a host from time to time. And when he's not doing that, he's singing Sinatra at cigar bars and nightclubs all over New England. It was wonderful having a fellow radiophile on to talk about the War of the Worlds as a primary source. So, as an executive producer of a radio show, I think it's just perfect for the topic. Originally, we were going to be talking about the Honeymooners and Jackie Gleason because a few weeks ago, when you were taking over the hosting duties of the Howie Carr Show, you were talking with a lot of the callers about the Honeymooners and providing all sorts of great trivia and facts about them. And that's where I was listening. I was driving around. I was like, oh, I got to contact him right away because I think that would be a great time and place to talk about of, late 40s, early 50s, and that, kind of the birth of the sitcom. But then I know that we are approaching the 85th anniversary of the War of the Worlds, and that being a radio drama, and you and your role in radio as executive producer, I thought this was just a perfect fit. And you did have a piece of trivia. There's a connection between our subject Orson Welles and Jackie Gleason.
Right, Jackie Gleason, famous comedian, famous TV star, mostly of the 1950s. I mean, he was anything he put his mind to, he was adept at. He was the master, be it sitcoms, film, music. He released dozens of albums of his own orchestrations. That's up for debate whether he was actually at those recording sessions or had anything to do with it, but I like to think that he did. So with all that in mind, I think this took place maybe at Toots Shor's Saloon in New York City, where he was gathered around with Orson Welles and several others of equal caliber, and Orson Welles dubbed Jackie Gleason the Great One, and that name stuck. And Lucille Ball kind of took up that mantle and referred to Jackie as the Great One, and that's his moniker.
So I like that, the connection, the bridging of the eras, because Orson, what we're about to dissect tonight, was sort of what put him on the map, so to say, especially as because he was a pretty young guy when he did War of the Worlds. So for those of you listening for the first time, the way we do things on this podcast is we take a piece of pop culture, something that was either intended to be or turned out to be enjoyed by a wide audience, and use that by dissecting it to tell us something about the time period from which it came. So with 1938, the War of the Worlds, given that's a radio drama, I think it's just perfect to try to figure out clues about the time period that you wouldn't necessarily get from other places. So we can jump in really anywhere on the form, but I usually like to start, and I think considering the title of this one, with the very first question, which is, what material was it made from, and how was it made? So the material that the entire radio drama was based on was the H.G. Wells story, the book of War of the Worlds. And to my understanding, it's not a coincidental thing that their last names are Wells, that Orson and H.G. were related distantly from each other. That's not super important to what we're doing tonight, but that story, the War of the Worlds, have you got, so like my first interaction with the actual story and was this radio play. I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents gave them a gift of all these old radio dramas on tape, and we listened to them. And I think this was the first one that we listened to, was War of the Worlds. And I was terrified. I was probably like 6 years old. And like when they start, the walking machines start coming out and like start killing people with their heat rays and stuff. And you hear the guy screaming. I was like, I'm done. I'm out of here. And I didn't want to know anything else about it. But I've since subsequently fallen in love with the story, and I like so many of the different tellings of it. And just like so many other stories like it, each time it's made, there's a reason behind it. So, have you ever read the book War of the Worlds?
I don't think I've ever read the original H.G. Wells version. When I was a kid, my parents would shop we had this store called Building 19, and many New England folks are familiar with Building 19. And they used to sell these 4x4 novellas. These were condensed versions of classics, and one of them that my parents got for me was War of the Worlds. And I remember flipping through that and reading it many times over, and they all had their own illustrations, and I was looking at the pictures of the depictions of the Martians, and I was hooked on that story. That's what got me hooked on science fiction. I loved it. I didn't discover the radio drama until probably many years later when I was in high school. I had worked one summer with my grandfather in North Carolina. He owned a construction business, and I was a laborer for the summer. And he had a friend that collected and repaired antique radios. I thought that was an interesting hobby. I'd like to see them. And I ended up purchasing one from him. And, when you buy an antique radio in working condition, you almost somewhat expect to get the same programming that it was designed to receive, but you're getting, the pop music of today through that radio. So, I mean, it wasn't, or the AM talk, most of them were AM sets. So I went on my own and discovered a lot of these old time programs, the Jack Benny shows, Milton Berle, Red Skelton, and eventually stumbled across the world of radio horror. And of course, War of the Worlds reigns supreme in that category. So I listened to that in high school.
I love what you said about that, because I thought the same way too. We inherited a big old radio set years ago now, and I kind of had this idea it'd be kind of like a kinked up hose, that once you plugged it in, suddenly like all this music that it hasn't been able to play for years just came shooting out of it, and we'd have to take our time to catch up with it, keep it on all the time just to let the years spill out. I listened to a lot of radio shows when I was in college, because I worked a job on campus cleaning pots and pans for one of the dining halls, and it was a late night job. So Sunday nights I'd work, and the local NPR station, which was actually on campus, would play, they call it Theater of the Mind, and they would just play old, The Shadow. They would have that. They would play, comedies, but a lot of just everything. And some of them I was actually surprised how late into the 20th century they were produced, 50s, sometimes even as late as the 70s, that they were still doing radio dramas. And I know they put Star Wars on the radio. That was a thing after the movies had come out. And I just loved listening to it, because it kind of took me away from what I was doing. It wasn't the most glamorous job to be covered in, suds and grease and stuff like that. And I remember one time these older women that were working there, they were getting off their shift, and they saw me just kind of doing my thing, and the radio was playing, and they're like, "Honey, are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just enjoying this combination of I don't want to really listen to music right now. This is fun, just listening to, a couple hours of good theater of the mind. I can invent the images in my head, and I don't need somebody to tell me what they are." So the War of the Worlds has been represented several times in media. It's one of those stories. The following year is when The Wizard of Oz came out in movie form, and I feel like that and Gone with the Wind came out that in 1939 as well. That one even more so hasn't ever been touched again. I know they made a made-for-TV movie for the prequel, Scarlet or something, but nobody's ever tried to redo Gone with the Wind. Whereas War of the Worlds, they're no, let's just do this every couple of years. We'll make another version of it. So the original one, the book by H.G. Wells, was very much a anti-colonialism testament. H.G. Wells himself was kind of borderline early socialist, very left-leaning in his politics, and was basically writing a story of against imperialism in Africa, and how would we like it if we woke up one day and suddenly there's these visitors with but they're eventually taken down by infectious diseases, not to give away the end of the story, but and then you leap ahead, so we're going to talk about this one, but then when they make the movie out of it, I think in the 50s or 60s, by that point, it's straight up Cold War. It's very much commentary on, fears of Soviet invasion. And then one of my favorite ones, speaking of Steven Spielberg, because before we hit record, we were talking about Steven Spielberg, is the 2005 War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise. And despite its flaws, it doesn't really have a third act. I love that one because if you compare it with Independence Day, which is exactly the same story, it's basically War of the Worlds from 1996. it's on either side of September 11th. The kinds of stuff they were doing with Independence Day became real on September 11th, and it was terrifying. So when you watch War of the Worlds, and both movies are made after we know that there's not actually Martians. They don't really explain in War of the Worlds in 2005 which planet they're from, or if they're from another planet, whatever. And the way that they shoot that movie it recalls a lot of the fear that we were feeling on September 11th, and in its aftermath of confusion, not knowing how to respond, war on terror type stuff. And it's like, so this same story that was invented in the 1890s revisits us every so often. And with 1938, do you think that Orson Welles was in his mind thinking, I'm going to use this story, the politics, the society, the world around us right now in 1938, does it show itself in his selection of this story to make a radio drama?
I think there's an element to that. In 1938, Hitler is coming to power, and America is on the brink of, well, we don't really know what's to come, but we know that we're probably going to be involved somehow, whether we inject ourselves or somebody injects us for us. So there was a lot of angst about that. I would imagine that we would be invaded or thrust into something that we didn't technically really want to be a part of just yet. And we were also struggling to come out of the Depression era. This was Dust Bowl days where people were just scrimping and saving whatever they could just to survive. And it was, they were just on pins and needles. What is the world going to throw at us next before we are no more as a society or just as a family? People, I would imagine, were very individualistic in that way at that time, though there was a great sense of community throughout America, small town America. It was every man for himself kind of way. So for Orson Welles to come up with this dramatization and kind of modernizing it to the 1930s, just about the 40s, I think preyed upon a lot of the fears that people had at that time, that this was just one more thing that was going to break their backs.
I gotta agree. I mean, I really think that's, when he was kind of, shuffling through stories to tell. And I think another dynamic of it is using the radio, because Orson Welles he became known as Citizen Kane was just a couple years later. So, he became a filmmaker too. I think his choice of saying, not only am I going to use War of the Worlds, but I'm also going to use the media, the media form that most people, I think, yes, the 1930s is the beginning of the golden age of motion pictures because they provided an outlet and a haven for folks during that time period. But radio even more so, because radio is affordable. It was everywhere. You didn't, once you owned one, you didn't have to pay to listen to what was on. So it was, provided people comfort and company. That's why Roosevelt used it throughout the 30s, in his fireside chats, because he knew that was, eventually what television became, was going to be in everybody's home. So, between maybe not having the ability to turn that story, that science fiction story, into a movie, the technology wasn't quite there to make convincing effects perhaps, but also, hey, we're approaching Halloween. I want to maybe take this scary story and do something. Now, the how it's made, I still think it's ingenious, and it's been tried a few times since then, especially with television. Never really works, but it's ingenious to present it as a news broadcast. Why do you think that because the last 16 minutes of it are traditional radio drama. Do you think that also says something about, going back to your idea of people just being like, I don't know what's going to happen next. Like this, I wouldn't be surprised because that's where they're going to fetch the information from. It's not going to be the newsreel at the Saturday matinee because that's only once a week. It's going to be, radio bulletin. So do you think that also, kind of marks it as period correct?
Yeah, I do. That was the main way that people were getting information as quickly as possible. I mean, back then you had a morning and a late edition paper, but that was only the news that had happened up until, the paper hit the presses. So anything that happened after that, you had to wait till the next morning, unless the radio was able to provide some information in between then as this sort of bridge between those mediums. Yeah, he used that to a great advantage. I think he counted on people tuning in late. He had a very keen sense of his competition on the radio at that time point on a Sunday night, and he knew that people would be flipping around the dial and tuning in late after his disclaimer at the beginning saying that this was a dramatization. And he instinctually modeled his actors' performances after real news broadcasts, real news bulletins. Just in preparation for the podcast today, I was just listening to some other information, and one of the actors based his performance on the actual newscaster who was at the Hindenburg disaster, and that same timbre of his voice and that same reaction as he was describing the events that were taking place or supposedly taking place in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. He had that same presence and awareness that actual reporter the year prior had describing the actual events of the Hindenburg burning before him.
Oh my goodness. So he probably, it's like reality was being fed in right into this production, that if that hadn't happened the year before and wasn't reported the way that it was, his mind might not have gone to let's make this at all or present it as a news broadcast. No,
it was presented as a very mundane Sunday night broadcast of some no-name band that was playing in a hotel in New York City. And if you just wanted some easy listening, and nobody would fight over what style of music, this was something that everybody could get along to because it was very innocuous. That's what you turned on, and then you heard this flash come across the radio saying that this world famous astronomer has seen something on the planet Mars, and your ears perk up, and so you're jarred by this information, and you're not given any awareness. You're not in on the joke yet because you probably tuned in late yourself. So he used something that was very real and put it into this fictionalized program to make it sound as if it were just any other program. It was genius, the effect that he used.
Is that what you like most about radio? Is your ability to use the medium as like that, like being able to have, because unlike when you perform live, when you sing, you get instant reaction from the audience, but with radio you can be creative with it like that, and you can be talking to millions of people and not even see them or understand their, you get on a show such as the Howie Carr show, you get callers in so often, but is it things like this that drew you to radio?
Absolutely. As I was saying earlier, when I was in North Carolina for that one summer, my interest peaked in old time radio shows. And I was stuck listening to that so much that I endeavored to get into broadcasting because of that. And through high school internships, I was able to land a job at my local talk station that my grandmother listened to, and I never did. But I came to love it because it was theater of the mind. You're presenting something. You're using your voice. You're using sound clips that you gathered from the real world in interviews and man on the street kind of stuff. And you're able to be imaginative and creative with it and present it the way you would want it presented, and convey a message that you wanted to convey to the listeners. And I still love that. I still think that radio is the most direct form of communication, because when you're watching TV, you are aware that the anchor or the host is speaking to not just you, but possibly millions of other people just like you across the country. But when you're in your car or you're at home, you're listening and it's directly into your ears, and you have no vision except this person at a microphone speaking directly to you. It's a very intimate form of medium. And that's why my philosophy has always been don't talk to a whole crowd of people, talk to one person. Pretend you're just having a conversation with one person across the table. And that conveys that feeling of intimacy that a listener will crave, because they want to feel like they're being talked with and listened to, that their ideas are valid. And that's something I really, really love about radio. It's that direct connection between yourself and the listener.
That close relationship, and people had that. It was much wider appreciated in 1938 than it soon became when the TV age took over. People then would have it as company, even if they weren't really listening in. And I think that's part of the reason why War of the Worlds was so effective. Because like you said, it was just kind of like, yeah, let's put this on. We're just driving around, or we're just, hanging out, and everybody's like tuning in and listening closer. And the reality is, if anybody actually knew things like the distance from Princeton or New York City to Princeton, like the reporter would not have been able to get to all these places in the amount of time that they gave them. But it's just kind of like radio is just part of the ether of that. It was just part of the atmosphere. It was just like you had it on, and it just, part of your day. And it also, I think, and this kind of, to wrap things up with how is it made in material, I think this exposes that, a good compare contrast between 1938 and almost 100 years later, 2023, Halloween had not consumed people's lives in 1938 like it had by now. And I love the fall, but I don't need my fall to be totally consumed by Halloween. It's like, give me the last part of October, I'll give you that. That's Halloween time. But now it's like, once you start seeing one leaf change, suddenly everybody's like, skeletons and vampires everywhere, and like, don't even bother going to Salem, because it's just going to be mobbed, with people, doing hocus pocus stuff, and all that kind of. And it's like, I don't think that was the way in 1938. I think, 'cause like in 1988, Halloween was just like, oh, that's one day of the year, you just do that thing and then move on with your life.
With any other big holiday, there was not as much commercialization back then that there is today. Like you said, this is probably brought up every year around this time, that spending on Halloween decorations is going to outpace spending on Christmas decorations. Yeah. That's a lot of people are very into Halloween, and it's their time to shine. I think that says a lot about the spirit of our collective society more than anything else. But it's weird. Yeah, I'm not a Halloween guy myself. I'm more a Christmas guy.
Yeah,
but
and don't get me wrong, I love a lot of aspects of Halloween. I like, I have a young son, so I like helping him think of a costume and work on it and things like that. And I used to be a lot more about it, but nowadays when it starts in August, I'm like, give me some time to breathe here. I like to, I like to think about other things. It's not just about
like presidential elections. They go on for way too long. Yeah,
exactly.
Enough already.
It starts like January 21st. And so, I guess that part of it can really kind of tell us the pace of life. Things were speeding up in the 30s. There's lots of evidence to point at that, as far as, the roadways were getting more congested. There was, speaking of January 20th, that in that decade is when they shortened the time from when a president's elected to when they're inaugurated, because they were afraid of that lame duck period where, we need to get things done. We need to make sure that, and that's, like Washington, D.C. started to grow in the 30s because the federal government was, pulling in more and more authority, and things, like I said, were just getting, we would consider them slow to today's standards, but for the, that time period, things were moving along pretty quick. And so, I think that this story kind of matches up pretty well with that idea as well. The next question is, and we can double up on this: who likely made it, and what was their status or role or status in society? Orson Welles didn't write the script, but he's the one that kind of dreamed it up and performed it. There's a gentleman by the name of Howard Koch, I think it is, Koch, who was the one who made the screen play, or the script for it. But let's talk just briefly about Orson Welles and where he was in that era. Late 30s, he's in his early 20s. This is what put him on the map, so to say, right? I mean, he was an entertainer. He was, trying to dabble in lots of different things. Do you think that in the back of his mind, he's like, this is going to put me in the spotlight?
I think that was on the front of his mind. I don't think it was in the back. Okay. I think that was exactly what he wanted. Again, doing just some preliminary research to freshen up on War of the Worlds. The Mercury Theater on the Air players, they didn't have a sponsor for their show. So they were probably worrying for their jobs in fear of getting canceled because they weren't bringing in any money. So Orson Welles, who was a huckster all of his life, I read a biography on him a few years ago, and he set out on his own as a very young kid. And he was selling paintings that he was doing, roadside paintings, for cash. He had no great artistic ability, but he would con people into buying his paintings. And that was the way he operated for the rest of his life. So I think that was very forefront. I mean, he even post 1950s Orson, actually 1950s Orson Welles, he had a lot of trouble with studio systems because he was famous for coming in over time, over schedule, over budget, but always had brilliant plans for his work. But the studios were losing money on him. So he had to come up with his own financiers and go to these very romantic, elegant cities and countries and talk to people of elevated status about getting financing for his films because none of the studios would do it for him. So I think this was kind of the first iteration of conning people into sponsoring his program and ensuring his future. And as fate would have it, Campbell's Soup came on as a sponsor a mere few days after the War of the Worlds broadcast because they saw the publicity potential and knew that people had Orson Welles on their map now, and they were going to be tuning in. So they were capitalists at Campbell's and took advantage of this wave of Orson Welles mania. Yeah.
It seems like that kind of go get him, like nose to the grindstone type attitude gets lost a lot of time. So we think of the 30s, you think of the Great Depression, you think of the New Deal, you think of, all those kinds of like, turn to the state, they'll help you, like Washington, D.C. is your salvation kind of thing. Where the self-made man, the real like Renaissance man, just the capitalist basically kind of gets not covered in that era at all. But it's a very American thing, for pretty much the entirety of the history of the country is, I I haven't read the whole thing, and I'm going to butcher the guy's name. But the French author, or the French diplomat, I guess, who visited the country in about a century before the 1930s, so in the 1830s, and he wrote Democracy in America. That was his report about it. He basically identifies what makes Americans different from the rest of the world, at least Europeans, in that he's like, you can find in America, and he was really like glorifying it too and saying how great it is. He's like, you can find in America somebody who is a lawyer and also a shopkeeper and, a physician and like does all these things and really wants to be the best they can be at each of those things. He recognized it with commerce on the high seas. He's like, a British sea captain, a merchant ship, might get the idea that, weather is not going to be good. So he'll skip, the port or whatever and, try to just, make up time elsewhere. And whereas the American is willing to go through the storm and make anchor and, and just like make it work basically, like, and really prove themselves as worthy of the business that they will get. And it seems like when we look back on the 30s, that kind of person doesn't really shine as much because it doesn't match the narrative of, everybody arm in arm together, let's get through this to, somebody like Orson Welles, who's like, I didn't know that thing about him making pictures on the side of the road, but I can see it, like him just be like, well, I'm just going to, like, I have paper, I have, something to draw with that's so industrious and, and so it's like, and given the time period also, if you wanted to be an entertainer, you had a couple of different avenues that you could go down, and each might prove to be your way to the top in that time period. It's it wasn't necessarily the movies. It wasn't or you could just dabble in each one of those things. And it seems like that was part of his status as well, is that he was willing to try his hand at all forms of media and just, see what he could make it on.
Right, he had the Mercury Theater on the air, but that was kind of an offshoot of the Mercury Theater Players. They actually had an on-stage repertoire of Shakespearean plays that they would do, and they would kind of popularize those and condense them for air. And but it's nice to listen to those, but I'm sure that it became kind of tiresome for a lot of the listeners out there that were yearning for something a little more modern, and so he developed with the help of Howard Koch this script, almost said screenplay. There's no screens for it to be seen
right.
on, but he was kind of an outlier, Orson Welles. I think he was very meta in the way he thought about things. He was always looking for this angle. I mean, he was kind of like a much more successful M. Night Shyamalan of his day, where he was always looking for this twist on how to distort your view and get you to look at something from a completely different angle. And again, that's something that he did throughout his entire career. There was this documentary that he did in the 70s, I believe. It's called F is for Fake. And he told this story of going back to art, this art forger, and how he was so successful in his forgery business, and yet nobody really knew anything about him. So he set out to Spain or wherever to learn more about this guy. And it turns out at the end of the documentary, Orson Welles pulls the cover off the whole thing and says, none of this is real. I made this guy up. I'm the forger. That's how his mind worked. He was always trying to trick you into believing something and to manipulate your vulnerability. And in 1938, so many people were vulnerable because they were at the mercy of what they had available to them. And again, one of those things was radio. Not everybody had a radio in their households, but usually somebody in the neighborhood did. And people were invited over for dinners and listening to the radio afterwards as entertainment. And they relied on that for their stream of information and entertainment. I mean, it was an all-in-one capsule of what culture was in those days. So to harness the power of that in the way that he did was, and I feel like I'm ending every answer with this, was genius of Orson Welles.
And I find that with a lot of the topics that I cover on this podcast, that tends to be what comes up, is that, attention to detail, forward thinking, trying to be creative with, the media form that you're working with seems to be pretty standard for all of them. That's why they're memorable. That's why they, we're able to take time to talk about it. And I think that also explains why he made it, which is the next question. Why did they make it? And so the timing couldn't have been better. I should restate what I was saying before. People did celebrate Halloween in the 1930s. It just wasn't as gigantic as the way it became later on. So when he's looking at this, like, now is the time, and he even says this in the in the epilogue of the presentation, is our way of saying boo.
That's
that
my
we
favorite
are,
part of the broadcast. The grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is just an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch. That's perfect.
It's so well said, and it's like that's why he did it, because he just wanted to, use the feeling of that time of year to join in. And it's almost like April 1st. Sometimes I'll be listening to the radio. It happens, I think, on the radio more often than elsewhere, when somebody will do a April Fool's joke, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's April 1st, so I can't listen to everything here, totally giving my confidence in it. And similarly with Halloween, it has a lot of trick or treat kind of thing to it. And so that, I think that's a quick one to check the box on why he made it. Well, he was already making them anyway, and he wanted to try something new. What better time to do that? The location part, I'm a big firm believer that geography plays a pretty big role in why things are made and what it can tell us. Like, people behave differently in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world. Their interests are different depending on where they are. This was made out of New York City, correct?
Yes, it was. Yeah, the CBS broadcasting building.
And I'm not sure if it's overly stated about the panic that it caused. Some people said that, people committed suicide that night because they were so terrified of a Martian invasion. I don't know how much of that is true, or, if there was, people like fighting in the streets for the next, cab out of town or something. But if there was anywhere that you could be rest assured you were safe, if you tuned in late and didn't catch that opening, that, hey, this is just a joke, is in New York City. Because you're looking outside and you're like, I don't see any aliens crossing the East River. Like, what's this guy talking about? So it's like, but it seemed like everywhere else, they were everywhere else in the country, or wherever else they got the signal, they were at the mercy of, because they had no way of knowing. It wasn't like they had earth cams that they could just turn on and say, oh no, right, New York's fine. So I think that played to his hand once again, that he was able to make this authority sounding, this is the news, you're listening to the news right now. And people outside of, making up fictional Grover's Mills, which I always thought of the Sesame Street character when I listened to that. When I was a kid, I was like, what, that guy?
Well, my understanding is Grover's Mills is a real place. It's a real town.
It is? Okay.
About 11 miles from Princeton, New Jersey. So, in writing the script, Howard Koch said he wanted someplace that was believable, someplace rural, that nobody's really heard of but sounds believable enough where you're going to buy the rest of the story. Johnny Carson used to say, you buy the premise, you buy the bit. Well, if you buy Grover's Mills is a real place and it's a small town that you've probably never heard of, but it probably does exist, you'll buy the rest of what we're about to tell you. So he had pulled out a map of New Jersey and just looked in proximity to Princeton, where Orson Welles' fictional character of this astronomer was supposed to be based out of. And, wouldn't you know it, here's where the Martians landed, right nearby.
Yeah.
It just made for a convenient storytelling material so that they could advance the Martians into New York City with relative ease and
right.
surprise, the element of surprise.
And, if they had called it like Goofball Town or something like that, everybody would be like, nah, that's stupid. That can't possibly be real. So I think we've covered this a little bit. The intended audience. So you mentioned that advertisers may have been part of the intended audience, not necessarily even a particular group of listeners, but generally speaking, who was listening to the radio in 1938, especially in the evening hours? It was mainly adults, correct?
Yeah, entire families. I mean, you had all kinds of programming on, and Sunday night, kind of a family night. It's more family-oriented programming. You're probably not getting all your murder mystery dramas on a Sunday night. You're getting maybe more comedy central programs or get Shakespearean or music programs. So yeah, you've probably got the whole family after dinner crowded around the radio in the living room listening. I think the intended audience was anybody who owned a radio or knew someone who owned a radio, not just advertisers, because without the listeners and the hysteria that was caused among the listeners, you wouldn't have advertisers paying attention to your program now. So anybody with an open pair of ears. And again, speaking to Orson Welles' genius, he knew the landscape of the radio programming competition. Also on the same time that night was this strange program of Edward Bergen and his Charlie McCarthy puppet. Now, who had the brilliant idea of putting a ventriloquist on the radio? This is beyond me. But it was a popular duo. And they had it was a variety show. So they would start out with, this funny opening monologue and set the premise for the rest of the show. And then either cut to a commercial or to the musical guest star of that week. And they'd sing some sort of, pretty innocuous song. And that's when Orson knew that people would be turning the dial to listen to something else while they waited for this song portion of the program to be over with. And that's when he caught their ears with these news flashes coming across the radio. So I think he knew exactly who he was going after, putting that disclaimer right in the beginning, very brief. I think it was less than a minute where you were able to catch that this was indeed a dramatization of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, presented by Orson Welles, who actually read the prologue of H.G. Wells' story before kicking off the fake news broadcasts.
And I got to say, Mercury Theater sounds a lot cooler than, Edward Bergen and his dummy. It just sounds like much more of a serious kind of cool sound to it than what was on the other station.
Right, but I mean, even with the name, if you were not a fan of Hamlet or Othello in those days, you probably it wasn't probably your first choice to tune into.
Fascination with visitors from other worlds hadn't established itself into the popular culture yet. That was definitely a post-World War II thing.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, so that audience wasn't really as concerned about Martians, or it was just like the idea of invaders coming in, like seeing, like you were saying before, is that sense of tension that Europe was feeling at the time, of at any minute now this thing could get out of hand with invasions and things that would unfold the following year, and had been going on in Asia for most of that decade, could be coming our way now. So they could have really, I know that the original book says Mars too, but they really could have just put anything in there, and invaders from anywhere, and it would have probably caused similar reaction. But it shows something about kind of where aliens fall on our like meter of what we're afraid of and things like that, and how it fits. Because think about just a few weeks ago, they in Congress they basically said aliens are real and we have some of them. And nobody cares.
Cares.
I'm like,
I care, but nobody cares.
Like, unless this is turning into like an Orson Welles thing too, of it was just a joke. Like, those are a bunch of people goofing off. But yeah, that's like it. It shows our relationship with, how we perceive, I guess, our world, our what's around us, what we can control, what we can't control.
Well, and you got to think in terms of 1938 as well. I think the general population's understanding of space was very crude. I mean, the most outstanding part of the broadcast that I think I would have picked up on if I were listening to it in 2023, and they said that flashes from Mars have been seen. And then a mere few minutes later, they're crashing onto Earth. Wait, that takes months. That doesn't take a matter of minutes. That probably would have been unbelievable to me. But maybe back in 1938, just the astonishment of we're seeing stuff from Mars. That's enough to make you question what's to follow, where you're bound to believe whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think people had already kind of adjusted their way of thinking to give a lot of faith and confidence to experts. Mm-hmm. They're like, yeah, that guy's a scientist, take his word for it. Sure, it's coming from another planet, and not, because like you said, it's a very, for most people, pretty basic understanding. Even for a lot of experts, there was not a clear, without putting anything up there to measure and to figure things out, it was a lot of theory going on, and not a big part of people's lives to question, what's this guy talking about? No, there's no way you can get from Mars to here in that amount of time. Do you think there's any other kind of behaviors or just general ideas that come with anything we haven't covered yet as far as dissecting War of the Worlds, that maybe any kind of subtext or things that were just kind of floating around during this production?
I mean, as far as behaviors go, it really revealed how susceptible we are and how much at the mercy of our information providers we are. We're not the generators of information. We're the receivers. So whatever's put through that radio or through that computer screen or the television screen, if it's presented as fact, we're bound to believe that. And nowadays we have all kinds of different outlets where we can pick and choose what side of the facts we want to fall down on.
Right.
But back then it was just, it was like growing up. If you didn't have cable, you had 3 channels that you were able to rely on, your ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was the same thing with radio back then. You only had a very limited amount of channels to tune into or stations to tune into. So there were a lot more people listening and consuming this information, and it was something you relied upon day after day. And I think it probably woke up a lot of people after they got angry with Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater broadcast. They probably got angry at themselves for even falling for it in the first place.
Right.
This just readiness to accept whatever comes across, probably for that generation, made a lot of cynical skeptics.
Yeah. Well, and it also, I think I remember reading that a lot of people turned to the FCC as well, which was like a lot of those federal agencies, kind of put in place after the fact, like after the innovators showed up and started using radio waves for communication, especially correct to the time period. There's a federal government saying, oh, we need to regulate. We need to make sure there's some kind of standard here. And that impulse in at least some of the population to complain to them about you being fooled, by this trickster, Orson Welles, also speaks to the time period too, that people didn't just feel like, just move on with their lives, or like you said, turn to themselves.
Well, and he knew that there were already kind of systems in place where you had to pause for station identification, and he purposely delayed that up to a certain point in the script, probably about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through, so that he wouldn't break that tension, so that people would be on the edge of their seats. And by that time, he's figuring people are already out on the street, or, they're not even paying attention anymore.
Right.
So he's fulfilling his obligation to these censors and the red tape, as it were, and kind of skirting around the rules a little bit, while still fulfilling his obligations. He knew what he was doing. But I'm sure I haven't looked into this specifically, but I'm sure there were a lot of new regulations put in place after this broadcast to ensure that something like this didn't happen again.
Yeah, because it did cause a panic. Yeah,
it did. I don't think there were any suicides or murders or anything like that, but people were upset, and they sure some of them took to the roads and fled. But there was definitely mass hysteria. But for instance, in Radio Now, you cannot pretend, and I came up through the newsroom in my career, you cannot use a real newscast, and portray fictitious events as fact. That's illegal. You cannot do that. Mm-hmm. There was a station back in the 80s, I believe, and Howie Carr tells a story every April Fool's Day. They pretended that the Blue Hills Reservation area just outside of Boston was an active volcano and had just erupted, and this sent a lot of people into a panic. One woman let all the horses out of her barn and told them to run for their lives.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
and that there's very little evidence of that broadcast left. I haven't been able to find it. If somebody has it and they want to send it to me, please do. But that station and those people in charge got into a lot of trouble for things like, and that happens every year. Some radio station tries to pull a prank and it just goes wrong. But there's a lot of regulation around presenting fiction as fact, because they know what's happened before.
And that I think brings us to a really good spot where I can just ask you about, because the title producer, you're an executive producer of the Howie Carr Show. In radio, that means something pretty different from television and movies, right? Like, it's not the same job as when you see a producer, listed on like the credits for a movie. You are much more actively engaged during the entire process of broadcasting, and having to be constantly aware of those kinds of rules and regulations, correct?
Right. Yeah. You have to be kind of a filter, and you've got to be kind of the bad guy. If the host or another person on the crew comes up with an idea, you have to say, well, you can't really do that. There's this regulation, that regulation, and just a matter of ethics as well. But yeah, I'm involved in the entire process from start to finish. I'm in the office 9 a.m. and we're working through the day, what the news stories are, how do we advance this, how can we approach it, what guests can we have on to talk about it, what sound cuts do we need to get, where does everything need to be presented. And you can't just pick up any, because there's a lot of sources out there nowadays, and more often than not, they can be quite erroneous, and you have to do your own fact checking in real time to make sure, especially if you're already on the air and the host is hosting the show and you're behind the glass and you're trying to find anything new to to discuss or any breaking news, if something comes up and you're not sure if it's validity, you've got to censor yourself from printing that story out and running it in, saying, "Look at this unbelievable story." You've got to cross check and look for multiple sources. So you're kind of the last stop for information, whether it's true or false, before it gets to the air. So there is a lot of inherent responsibility there.
Yeah. So coming up in a few months, if you suddenly get a news feed coming in saying that Martians have landed in New Jersey, you're going to be like, wait a minute.
I've heard this before.
This. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, considering the way things are, I think some people might be like, what? Especially if you put it on their phones in front of them. They might actually...
I probably would a part of me would probably want to believe that it's true, because what else can go wrong?
Right, like just add this to the list. It's
right.
It's very,
Why not?
We have that in common. Considering all your responsibilities and everything, I really appreciate you taking the time talking to me about this. And besides daily on the Howie Carr Show, which is not just broadcast in New England, you guys are on Newsmax, correct? So you can watch it as well?
Yeah, we're on Newsmax streaming. We're on Rumble, rumble.com/The Howie Carr Show. Follow us on Twitter at Howie Carr Show, Facebook, any social media. Our Instagram page is doing well. So yeah, we're everywhere. People listen to us all over the world. It's incredible.
I've been listening to it for years. It's just part of, I always think to myself, because being a teacher, my, schedule is usually such that I'm listening right at 3, but then I'll get home and I delight when I have to go back out and it's right around 5 o'clock, because, that's when the Chump Line's coming on. And that's for years has been like my favorite 10 minutes of... It's heartbreaking when I know when it's coming, when the doot, comes up, and I'm like, that's the last one, because you
hear the audio pipe back up a little bit, yeah,
you're like, that's a cast of characters in its own right too. There's regular callers with impressions of different political and pop culture figures calling, quote unquote, calling in and leaving their messages. It's like
those are mostly the same guy that's doing those impressions.
Yeah. I love that. It's just kind of like an unofficial member of the show cast, so that's a lot of fun.
I've gotten to meet that caller, and
oh really?
Sometimes he does a hate mail for me. We do a hate mail Monday session.
Yeah.
Whenever I fill in for Howie, I have to be very cautious of what I say, because I know it's going to be taken out of context. And it's become my wife's favorite feature of the show is this caller's hate mail for me. So when I met him, I made sure to get his autograph for my wife, because she's his biggest fan.
That's so much fun. And again, radio is still, I think, it might have its own niche now in a way. But
I mean, it's big. It's free. I mean, that's the biggest thing going for it. It's free. It's readily available, and I think the radio, if you're on top of what you're doing, you're trying to find a way to stay relevant to the many different outlets that we have available to us now. For instance, the streaming, it's non-negotiable. You've got to be streaming if you're terrestrial radio. If you're not streaming, you're dead. And a video component is helpful as well. Ours is not the most advanced. I mean, it's a pretty simplistic setup, but it provides the element that a lot of people like, which is you get to see who's talking and how they're making their gestures, and it just adds a whole new element to the show. So people really enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, I realize I'm taking part in making the competition for radio by making a podcast, but I still am. I like that little surprise you get sometimes. Before the internet, you wouldn't know at all unless you met them in person what the radio personalities looked like. You just kind of in your own mind, painted a portrait, and then when you did see them in person, you're like, "Whoa, you look totally different," than I thought. But nowadays with the streaming and a lot of live remote type things, it's like you get that. I don't want to say it's ruined, but it's just kind of like, oh, Now every time I hear you, I know what I'm looking
Wizard
at.
of Oz, you're seeing the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, absolutely. And another timely reference. So thanks again for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including 1938's radio drama War of the Worlds, is a primary source. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks so much, Eric.
The 1930s are often remembered as the golden age for motion pictures, and it absolutely was. But arguably, it was radio that enjoyed the American pop culture spotlight during the Depression years. I don't need to explain how much more accessible radio was and is than movie theaters, not to mention their very low cost of operating in an era when people were pinching pennies. But it's not just the effects of the Great Depression on society and culture that is revealed with the War of the Worlds on the radio. It's late interwar era American isolationism and all the anxiety and paranoia that came with it that shows itself as well. He may have claimed otherwise after the fallout of the panic-inducing radio broadcast of his, but Orson Welles absolutely knew what he was playing to when putting together and performing this rendition of the story in the style of a news broadcast. Just as it's debatable how big of a panic the Martian invasion story caused, it's hard to tell who learned more from the experience. Listening audiences to not believe everything the radio tells them, or Orson Welles for learning that pushing boundaries in media will have a big payoff. My guest for this episode can be heard every day on the radio. Logan each morning on WOKQ out of the seacoast of New Hampshire and Maine, and Taylor in the afternoon as part of the Howie Carr Show, which can be heard throughout the Northeast and seen all over the country. You can also learn more about Taylor channeling Frank Sinatra by searching Taylor Cormier Sings Sinatra on social media. I can be found pretty easily starting at everything-history.com. There you'll not only learn about my social studies and podcasting consulting and coaching services, but find all of my social media links too. Join me next time as we zoom ahead 35 years to 1973 to see about Billy Joel's Piano Man as a primary source as it celebrates its 50th birthday. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.